18 years ago, one game almost beat Call of Duty and even Battlefield to the punch with large-scale destruction, cinematic action set pieces, and a modern military setting that set itself apart in a sea of historical shooters. That game was Black, a very underrated and influential FPS game for its time, and thanks to some great new emulation tech, I can revisit this PlayStation 2 game in high-res glory. Let's check it out. Now, some of you may know Criterion Games from their work with the Need for Speed franchise or the Burnout franchise. Fans of this channel will know Criterion is a studio that's been heavily involved with Battlefield and Battlefront over the years. But back in 2006, Criterion launched Black, a globe-trotting FPS single-player game with large-scale destruction, high-fidelity guns, interesting stealth mechanics, and non-stop set-piece action. In a lot of ways, Black beat Call of Duty to the cinematic-style modern FPS, though few people remember that as Call of Duty 4 launched the next year, leaving Black in the dust. And while you might think that's simply because COD 4 was a superior game, in many ways, Black did things better. Revisiting this game today via the freshly released PC SX2 emulator, I'm kind of blown away by just how good it still is. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly a product of its time and was relegated to run on PlayStation 2 hardware, which I think came out in like the year 2000. The models are fairly blocky, the enemy AI is basic, and some of the set-piece stuff isn't quite as impressive as modern set-piece games. But if you look at other FPS games from this era, very few of them have held up as well as Black, and this game's innovative approach to mission design and destruction really set it apart from the other historical shooters of the time. Large-scale destruction simply wasn't a thing in most games from the late 2000s. Games that advertised it almost always faked it by having the destruction entirely scripted that happened under very specific circumstances or were very isolated interactions in otherwise static environments. In Black, it feels like just about everything in the game explodes if you shoot at it enough. Walls deteriorate over time, cover can be obliterated, and entire buildings will collapse. In 2006, this level of destruction was mind-blowing. And even today, I think it's genuinely impressive. The amount of smoke and debris that gets kicked up in every firefight borders on the level of ridiculous. Half the time you can't even see the enemy you're trying to kill because of the dust storm that your bullets are kicking up. But when the smoke settles and there's a massive hole in the wall that the enemy was hiding behind, you forget for a second that this game is 18 years old and the only thought going through your head is, dang, this is cool. Now, Black isn't special just for its destruction. It's also got some pretty legit stealth mechanics. You can shoot out lights, hide from enemies, pick them off with well-placed headshots, and even sneak past enemies all together to avoid combat, which for an action shooter wasn't particularly common. Most missions in Black start with you inserting undetected into a mission space, and the amount of enemy resistance you face is pretty much up to how stealthy you can be. And the levels themselves are fairly open, with multiple routes to the main objective and several side objectives. It kind of reminds me a bit of games like Delta Force and Dishonored, where each level has a main goal, but you're free to tackle several side objectives before you actually complete that goal. It's not quite a fully open and immersive sim, but it's a far cry, pun intended, from the more traditional shooters that were very linear, practically on rails in terms of what objectives you were supposed to go to next. Now, the weapons are surprisingly well realized. Multiple fire modes, detachable suppressors, variable zoom scopes, impressive handling animations that put other games from 2006 to shame. Sure, they don't hold a candle to the most impressive games coming out today, but considering that many of Black's contemporaries still had guns that would reload by moving them off screen or bouncing them up and down to simulate a magazine being inserted, this is just impressive by comparison. One area that I really appreciate, having gone back and played a lot of these old school titles, is key rebinding. Black is one of the rare console titles from its time that actually features full controller button remapping. This makes it a great game to go back and play, because if you're doing what I'm doing and going back and revisiting old school titles, you'll realize pretty quickly that a lot of older games have crazy key binding setups that feel like an alien designed them. You forget that in the mid-2000s, gamers were still trying to figure out what control schemes were good for the first-person shooter. Now it's more or less been standardized, but back then, you could get all kinds of crazy setups. Now, usually when you come across a game that still holds up this well so many years later, you can thank the fantastic art team. The sound design of Black is absolutely balls to the wall, gut punching. The guns are loud and gritty, the explosions are deafening, the music is sparsely used, but when it kicks in, you know it's go time. And Criterion's expertise in sound design from their racing games gave Black a really unique and kind of bombastic sound that's probably one of the game's most timeless aspects. And it's also not afraid to be quiet when it needs to be. There are some somewhat disappointing, I would almost call them tropey aspects of the sound design though. Suppressed weapons sound kind of like that classic Hollywood pew pew guns, which is just sort of hilarious during a full-blown gunfight. The line delivery from the game's voice actors, especially during the cutscenes, is also super one-dimensional grizzly army guy.
Everything you did will be declassified. You will be convicted. You will be discharged. You will spend the rest of your life in prison.
What do you want me to do?
But beyond that, the game's sound is incredibly respectable. Now, truly, if you're looking at this and going, why wasn't this a real competitor to the COD franchise? Well, the obvious thing that held this game back was simply not having multiplayer. If we're just comparing single-player experiences, Black holds its own even against Call of Duty 4. But it's impossible to argue that Black not having a properly fleshed out PvP multiplayer isn't the main reason it faded into the background of gaming history. Multiplayer was not an expected feature for most first-person shooter action games back in the mid-2000s, and the industry was just starting to shift more of its focus towards PvP games. Black was received with favorable reviews, and I believe it sold pretty well for its time. Had it had that multiplayer component, who knows where it could have gone. And despite this game's failing to stand tall in Call of Duty's shadow, you can still see its influences in modern games. Battlefield Bad Company launched in 2009, introducing the world of Frostbite 1.0 with its full-scale destruction. But Criterion's renderware game engine was the core of Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, and it likely helped push DICE's development of Frostbite across the finish line. It's also funny seeing how closely the presentation of Battlefield 3's cutscenes mirror Black's, with a hostile and gruff military man interrogating a boots-on-the-ground soldier, with missions being his flashbacks of his side of the story. Black also utilized some interesting visual effects like blur and slow motion that have become hallmarks of action FPS games. So while this isn't exactly the Crisis or Half-Life of its time, it is still an interesting stepping stone that helps stylize modern FPS games. It's also one of the rare PlayStation 2 games that genuinely holds up to modern titles. Sony's best-selling console has a pretty notorious look to its library of games that is equally charming as it is telling of its era. You just know you're looking at a PlayStation 2 game when you see one. It's not a bad thing, but it does mean that many PlayStation 2 games look dated in a very nostalgic and distinct way. When emulated though, Black absolutely sings. And again, this is largely a testament to Criterion's expertise and art team. Pushing the game into widescreen and unlocking the FPS with a patch plus an updated texture pack, it takes things to the next level. And the latest release of PCSX2 is also worthy of mention. This update is the culmination of years of development progress and is hands down the best emulation experience that I've ever had. It's about as plug and play as it gets, and it runs pretty much every game I've tried flawlessly out of the box. So if you're looking to revisit a classic era of gaming, I highly recommend checking out Black. Criterion absolutely understood the assignment and delivered a unique experience. I'd be curious to know if you ever played Black back in the day, or if you had even ever heard of this game. Let me know in the comments, and drop me a like if you enjoyed this video, and hit that sub button if you want to see more content like it. Also, if you want to see one of the most visually impressive games ever released on the PlayStation 3, but emulated into even more beautiful detail, check out this video where I go back and play Killzone 3. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.